just as fundamentally citizens, we shouldn't put our opinions and our values on other people. But the general debate, as I said, is good. But in certain newspapers, it's being sort of stigmatised between for and against. And
what do you think the impact is of some of the more sort of strident opinions that have been put forward is on our actual individual children?
I think that they, for children in my form, they just don't see it as an issue. It's not. It's an issue that they don't have because they think that why don't they already have equal marriage? They know about civil partnerships. Civil partnerships should be open to heterosexuals too. There should be full equality. It's not. And I know this bill is not looking at that, but I know that's been put forward before. Young people are concerned as they're concerned with human rights. They're concerned about people being treated fairly and equally. But do they talk about this on the school gates? I'm sure not.
Thank you. Mr. Hayman.
I think I'd just add to that I think on a range of different issues that PSHE covers, there are strident opinions on all sides. And forgive me for these labels, but some people might consider some laws to be too liberal or not liberal enough. And I think that there are strong views on all sides about those laws. I think what we advise in terms of best practice is creating an atmosphere in the classroom where those issues are discussed in a balanced way with respect for people who hold a range of different views. And if I may say, it seems to be that's the sort of environment that this committee is creating as well.
Thank you. Jim Shannon, followed by Tim Loughton.
I'm keen in your comments, Mr. Parr, about how people can have opinions and at the same time be protected. I'm sure you're aware of the recent poll, which indicates that some 40,000 teachers would have difficulties with this redefinition of marriage and how that would affect them in the teaching in schools. And they would have some difficulty, indeed probably great difficulty, in how they can be involved in the training and the teaching, and how that would affect their conscience. Ever mindful of that, and that's a substantial number of teachers, if this bill should see its conclusion through the third reading in the House of Parliament, if that's where it ends up, how would you address the issue of those with very clear religious beliefs who have a conscience in relation to this matter, and do you see a criteria or a guideline set down where yes, the teachers may say yes, there is such a thing as same-sex marriage, and that's as far as it goes, or do you see it going beyond that? Ever mindful of those people who have conscience, like you referred to earlier on?
I would say first we don't need any more criteria set from the Department of Education. We have enough. We're busy sorting out the new graft of implementations from that, so I'd say no more policies. You say 40,000 teachers out of how many?
That's the poll. That's commission.
Yeah, so it's out of how many teachers that teach in the UK. It's a very small percentage, 40,000.
Well, I mean, Mr. Chair, but we've had church groups here this morning representing 5,000, 10,000 and so on, out of millions of people, so don't tell us about statistics and numbers, you know.
Well, I would start, and you talked about this idea of conscience. The conscience of a teacher is to teach. Okay, that's their first premise in a school. Okay, and so that my conscience, my beliefs take a back foot when I'm teaching children. Okay, and what I teach them, I must teach them, the absolute things that they need to know. And when we're talking about more controversial subjects and issues, as long as you're giving a balanced view on same-sex marriage, on abortion, on any of these different things, and that's absolutely fine. You can say I don't believe in equal marriage because I believe that a marriage is between a man and a woman. I don't know who decided that. So it must be balanced, and we must also say that there are relationships that do exist, and most of the time if you came to my school and you said a relationship between a man and a woman is absolute, they would tell you it's not. They would tell you that they belong to relationships in which there are two mums, there was one mum, there was a mum and dad, they're adopted, they're fostered. These are the sort of families that are...
I'm aware of the facts of the case, Mr. Chair, I'm well aware of the issues, but the issue I'm trying to get out of the gentleman is this. How does he see protection for those people who have a different point of view, from the point of view that you have?
Absolutely. I respect yours and their views. I absolutely do. But as I said, my job is to educate children, not to tell them what I think and what I believe.
I think probably quite helpful just to refer back to the DfE's, Department for Education's guidance on the Equalities Act 2010. I think it says quite clearly that having a view about something does not amount to discrimination. Yeah. However, if a school conveyed its belief in a way that involved haranguing, harassing or berating a particular pupil, then that would be considered to be unacceptable. So I think that's a fair position. The only other point that I would make is that we're already dealing with a wide range of issues where legislation may come up against people's individual moral or religious conscience. Abortion might be a good example. There are a very, very tiny number of cases where it amounts to disciplinary action. I think two of the safeguards that we have are the involvement of teachers along with community leaders and parents in putting together a school's sex and relationships education policy, and therefore their opportunity to feed into that process and to be involved in that process. But also the teacher exchange that I referred to earlier on, and just to answer your question, Mr. Lawson, those exchanges already take place in relation to issues like abortion or divorce, for example.
Thank you. Mr. Tim Lawson.
Thank you, Chairman. If I can pick up where I was cut off on that point earlier, because I entirely agree with what Mr. Hayman said, that sensibly some accommodation, to use a phrase, or maybe some way, as you put it, should be found so that teachers who have a problem, and we are potentially talking about 40,000 teachers, which is rather more than the three combined religions membership that we've had earlier. It's 10% of all teachers, according to a poll. How accurate that is, it's 40,000 teachers. It's a substantial number of teachers. How do we actually do it, which is the problem? Because when we asked the Secretary of State about this, he completely ducked the question. He just kept referring to inappropriate teaching. Now, would you support, absolutely, protection under the law so that if a teacher declined to be the Mrs. Miggins seconded to do SRE as part of PSHE on a Thursday afternoon because of his or her view, and because he or she felt that might come into conflict and therefore said, can I not do that? And if the school said, no, you must, you would support the teacher who wanted to opt out rather than risk saying something which could be deemed, in the language, whatever that means, of the Secretary of State for Education, as inappropriate teaching?
I mean, I think I would come at it from a different angle, and I hope that I'll still answer your question. I don't think that the educational experience of a child, and I think we should think of the pupil first, is going to be helped particularly by someone feeling that they are forced into a classroom against their will to deliver a lesson that they don't agree with. I would strongly hope, because of the protections that I talked about earlier on, teachers' opportunity to feed into the SRE policy, for example, the requirement that we're only talking about, and I would return to this point, we're only talking about providing a balanced picture of the situation, and included in that, explaining that in a democracy, laws are passed, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone agrees with them. I think we are only expecting those standards of best practice, but I think
we're not talking about fact necessarily. It's subjectivity that's involved here, because sex and relation education, the sex bit is quite a lot about fact.
Yep.
The relation bit is a lot about subjectivity. And if you were the counsellor in Relate who said, look, I have a problem with doing civil partnerships, I think that person was wrong,
Yep.
therefore can't we accommodate? The law said no, and that person lost their job. The same could apply to the teacher here, and it's likely to apply to more people, because there are more people who have a problem with same-sex marriage than now have a problem with civil partnerships. So how do we protect that teacher?
Yes,
under this law?
Yeah, I mean, I do think these issues are taking place anyway. You quoted the 40,000 teacher figure. I have no reason to doubt it. I'd be interested to see a similar poll done on teachers' feelings about abortion, for example. That's obviously been a legislative fact for a long time. And when I talked about teaching facts, I think all of the people in this room would at least want teachers to teach the law of the land, but also to teach the fact that in a democracy people have different opinions on things. So I think that's a fairly balanced position. But I think ultimately these exchanges that I talked about earlier on do take place, should continue to take place, and teachers shouldn't be forced to deliver a subject or an opinion which they don't believe in. I just don't think that's good for the child.
Yeah, just quickly, it's a shame that we're still obsessing about this question about teachers being disciplined over things they may not believe in.
It's an important point.
It is an important point, but I think it's been dealt with. But in PGC courses, what we should be doing, Tim, is we should be promoting diversity within, so they should be going to sessions and training. Because, of course, some teachers, a teacher this morning that I talked with, she was uncomfortable about telling boys about puberty because she didn't know very much about it. And so I took over, and that's absolutely fine, and we just negotiated that between us. And she spent some time with the girls. But if it's statutory and PHSE courses, that would really help. We're probably talking about many older people in the profession. That's just a generalisation, but we probably are.
Why?
It didn't help that the government scrapped the regulatory body that dealt with discipline in the teaching profession, because that's now gone. So it could be dealt with that way. But also, people are protected in their contracts under legislation in the Equalities Act.
Stephen Williams.
It was just over 7 years ago now that I persuaded my colleagues on the Education Select Committee at the time to do a really good report, I think, on bullying and homophobic bullying in particular, which led to Stonewall and then the last government, just say something nice about Mr. Balls, taking this issue on and putting some really good sort of guidance in place for how to deal with homophobic bullying in particular in every state school. But there were some problems around the country with parents saying, I don't want my children to know more about this, even though it was an anti-bullying policy. Over time, I've seen that largely disappear, certainly in my own constituency in Bristol. Is that your experience as a PSHE teacher, that there is less resistance to discussing openly homosexuality in school now?
Well, you're looking at me. I'm not a PSHE teacher, but just to say on behalf of the organisation, there is concerning evidence still coming through from Ofsted about homophobic bullying. It's been sort of classed as a major concern for them. So while some of that sort of normalisation process but you're talking about may be happening, I wouldn't be in the least bit complacent. In fact, we remain concerned about homophobic bullying in schools.
Mr. Chair, just to clarify, Mr. Hayman, it wasn't the prevalence of homophobic bullying I was asking about, it was the resistance from parents or other people to the teaching, through whether it's through citizenship, PHSE, drama, the FIT play was mentioned by you earlier. Is there less resistance to this being a core part of the curriculum now?
I wouldn't be able to say specifically. I would remain concerned about the Ofsted figures on homophobic bullying. I think that would be the key point to make. Yeah,
I mean, you're talking about the Stonewall report, and that's I think 2008 that was published, but it was an issue.
It was 2 years after the Education Select Committee. Yeah,
it was. There was a problem with a minority of students actually committing suicide, missing exams, not getting. 50% of LGBT kids are missing large proportions of school, so it is an issue. Parents, of course, they can say to teachers, "Can we not have them in lessons?" I teach in a school there's a large Muslim population, there's a large Somali population, and we've sent letters out and had meetings, and no parent has objected to any of their students being in. Could you sit down and explain the importance of diversity, especially in a city like London? But quickly, just back to Tim very quickly, teachers are more worried about pensions, pay, the curriculum, GCSEs, and not this issue. Not this issue, and also Ofsted. Just Ofsted also.
Very good try.
Ofsted do look at schools and think about how they include diversity within the curriculum and what they do as a school, and they're monitored and considered about that.
Thank you. Well done. A final question to Tim Lawton, and then we're moving on to our next set of witnesses. Mr. Lawton.
I'm sorry if Mr. Bradshaw doesn't want me to go into this, but it is a very important point for teachers for whom it will be an issue. And I entirely agree with everything that the speakers have said that was in order in terms of needing to have a better quality and need of teaching diversity and everything. Absolutely agree with all of that. We're really bad at it now. We need to be a lot better. Whatever my views on civil partnerships that I absolutely support, or on same-sex marriage, there is a point here that I am worried about, and many people amongst those 40,000 potential teachers are worried about and we will obsess about is why is that teacher going to have any protections given of what happened to the relate counsellor who was not able to have that sort of sensible accommodation, the maybe some way version that Mr. Hayman said, either to say, look, I'm not the right person to do this at all, and if I was in a same-sex relationship, I think the last person I'd want to go for guidance counselling from was somebody who didn't agree with being in same-sex relationships. So how can we guarantee with this bill, and I think you agree with my position, that we need to make it watertight, that that teacher can either say, that's not for me, I opt out, or if he or she is purely expressing a view without being haranguing and harassing, which is clearly inappropriate teaching. And this is the problem we have. The Secretary of State for Education did not define what inappropriate teaching is. And that's why I think without new guidance from the Department, we are going to have a problem with it. Do you agree with those two safeguards are essential if we are to achieve what I think all of us want to achieve?
Well, I agree with your position. I feel that the teaching standards that Mr. Parr referred to earlier on, the guidance from the Department for Education on Sex and Relationships Education and the Equalities Act 2010 already provides a framework under which we can work. You then have the safeguard of school governing bodies interpreting those that legislation and that guidance. I don't see that this presents an additional issue, and I would go back to my point earlier on. Regardless of what this committee decides, these issues are being discussed in playgrounds and classrooms across the country.
Sure.
It's not just same-sex marriage, divorce, abortion, whatever is decided. There will be people who have strong views on both sides on this issue. I think that the guidance and the legislation provides the framework we need.
Just very quickly, I thought the coalition government was about getting rid of red tape, and so having any more legislation would harm. We have the Equalities Act, which has safeguards. We have the teacher standards, and we also have, heads generally are quite reasonable. And if you do say I'm not comfortable with this, they would generally not make you. And also, if not, you go to your union and you seek advice.
Thank you very much indeed for your evidence this afternoon. We do appreciate it, and we're very grateful to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll now move on to our penultimate set of witnesses. Bye-bye, Chris. Well, good afternoon to our next two witnesses, and thank you very much indeed for being here. We know who you are, but would you like to please introduce yourselves for the record?
I'm Geoffrey John, I'm the Dean of St Albans.
Thank you.
And I'm Alice Arnold.
Thank you very much indeed. The first question, Kate Green.
Thank you very much. Do you think it's the role of the government and Parliament to redefine marriage in the way that this bill is doing?
I wish it weren't government and Parliament that were doing it alone in the face of objections from the Church. I don't actually agree that it redefines marriage. It seems to me that marriage stays the same as a result of this measure. We're simply making a decision about admitting a different kind of person to it. I mean, I'd compare it with the ordination of women in '92. When the Church of England ordained women priests, we didn't say that we were redefining priesthood or redefining the sacrament of ordination. We were simply admitting the other half of the human race into it. And I think it's that kind of change. It's a much less radical and revolutionary change theologically than it's being presented as.
Thank you.
A question? Or?
Well, no, I agree. I agree completely. I don't think it redefines. I think everybody knows what married means, in general terms. And I come here absolutely just as a member of the public who's gay. And I think everyone understands, children understand, what the word married means.
Ben Bradshaw.
Jeffrey John, I've asked every other representative of a religion the same question, which is some of those opposing this bill base their opposition on their understanding of Scripture and the role of tradition in their faith. How has your understanding of Scripture and the role of tradition led you to a different conclusion?
Well, that's potentially an extremely long answer. I have written on this at some length. Essentially, I don't think that the sayings about marriage in Scripture, certainly in the New Testament, which is obviously more relevant from a Christian perspective, really address the situation that we're in today. I mean, Paul, for example, who is really the person who counts in the New Testament, since he's the only one who ever addresses the issue of homosexuality in any sense, Paul clearly never takes into account the situation of two adult Christians wanting to commit to each other for life. I think that Paul makes two assumptions about homosexuality which make what he says not directly relevant to where we are. First of all, Paul clearly believes that homosexual acts are committed by essentially heterosexual people. That's why in Romans 1 he talks about exchanging the natural use. And it's quite clear in the way that's written that people have chosen to do that. It's not that they are homosexual by nature or orientation. He simply doesn't work with that concept. And also, I'd want to argue that Paul was attacking the prevalent forms of homosexuality that he saw in the Greek society around him, namely pederasty and paedophilia. I've no wish to defend either of those.
And when you, my understanding is that you would support the Church of England opting in to this law. Do you not think that that is a rather a distant prospect, given that they don't even yet properly recognise civil partnerships?
I don't know. We live in hope. I'm hoping that the Pilling report, which you know is coming out shortly, may recommend some acceptance of civil partnerships. There are already noises in the wings which suggest that bishops are moving around to becoming much more positive about them. I think we saw a bit of that on Tuesday. So I'm hopeful that that will be the first stage, but I will hope that we'll go beyond that ultimately toward, well, I'm sure we will go beyond it ultimately, actually, to blessing same-sex marriages. We'll get there, but the delay, I think, is more political than theological, in fact, at the moment.
Thank you. Jim Shannon.
Streeter, I'm keen to get your ideas, if I can, please, in relation to how this will affect teachers and registers. Would you support, or would you feel that there should be sufficient protection in place to safeguard teachers who may have to teach something that they're unhappy with from a religious point of view? And in relation to registers as well, I'm keen to get your opinion. And I know the Church has a very set opinion on this at this moment in time, and I would like to see what protection you feel could be put in place to ensure that teachers and registers are protected.
Are you asking me or?
Both of you.
I'm not a church person, I think you...
Yeah.
I certainly would want to defend the conscientious right of any teacher to state his or her own Christian conviction about marriage, even if that disagreed with mine. I think that's fine. I think it's important, though, that such a teacher also puts forward the other opinion. We'd expect that in a good teacher, whichever direction they were coming from. And of course, I think it's important to protect children in schools who may be coming from same-sex families, for example. It's important to protect children from belittlement or criticism or bullying in school. A teacher would have to be very careful not to foment that kind of negative attitude to any children in the class in a way that he or she taught his view.
And in relation to the registers, how can you give us the opinion of teachers? What do you feel there should be similar protection for the registers of councils in relation to marriage?
Sorry, I can't hear what you're saying.
My accent's a wee bit. You'll have to come to Northern Ireland and learn your accent. In relation to the registers, do you feel that registers should have equal protection? Those who register marriages.
Registrars.
Oh, registrars. I wouldn't be against that personally, I have to say. I think it would be sensible if local councils and so on made individual provision for registrars who seriously found that a difficulty, rather than simply sacking them. I would want to treat that in a humane sort of ad hominem basis.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank
you very much, Chair. I'd like to, this is directed at the very Reverend Geoffrey John. Now, obviously we have what's called a quadruple lock. Yes. And as I understand, if two people of the same sex who are Church of England parishioners wish to get married in the Church of England, and their priest wishes them to be married, or is quite happy for them to be married in his or her church, this actually is impossible under the current bill, is it not? What are your thoughts about that?
I think it's highly regrettable that the Church feels the need to have these triple or quadruple locks. My main worry about it, frankly, is the image of the Church that it puts to ordinary people, because my fear is that people will judge God by the Church on this. God is infinitely more compassionate and positive about gay people than the Church is, in my view. The love of gay people comes from God, and I think God wants to bless and strengthen and protect that love desperately. And I think the Church is horribly misrepresenting God in opposing that. So I'm very unhappy. I can see that in the political situation of the Church as it is, I can understand why it's been demanded, but I'm very fearful that the Church is forgetting its own gospel in making that demand.
So you, if you had your choice in terms of amending the bill, you would remove the quadruple lock, would you not?
I wouldn't want to amend the bill in order to force it on the Church, no. I don't think that would be right. It's up to people like me within the Church to argue with the Church and try to help it move along to a more Christian position.
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you.
Hugh Robertson.
It's got a question for Alice Arnold. You have a very high-profile civil partnership. What would you, and it always seems in all that we read about it, that this is an incredibly happy partnership. What do you, they're probably like most partnerships, it has its moments. Could I ask you the very simple question? What would the ability to get married add to your life?
It would be a massively important thing in that when I say, someone says to me, are you married? It's a very common question. I think it's a common question that we're all asked. And I say, no, but I'm in a civil partnership. I would love not to have to say, no, but. I'd really love to just say, yes. To all intents and purposes, we are married in the sense that everybody understands the word married. We've lived together for 10 years, we have joint bank accounts, we do everything together. Our nephews and nieces regard us as married, everybody we know, our parents regard us as married. But we have never used the term, because I used to be a magistrate and we're not allowed to. So, I have to say, I am not married, I'm in a civil partnership. I would love not to have to say that. I would love to just be like everybody else and just say yes. That's the difference it would make.
Thank you. Kate Green.
There are a couple of anomalies in this bill in terms of the way that same-sex married couples will be treated as opposed to opposite-sex married couples. For example, we heard earlier about differences in relation to pension rights, which the bill proposes. And also, there are differences around the significance of consummation for marriage. What's your view on having those anomalies? Do you have concerns about that?
I don't have concerns about the consummation. I think this comes with the sort of divorce element of the bill. And I think that is quite clearly covered. There's an allowance for either desertion or unfaithfulness, which would be unreasonable behaviour. Mm-hmm. And I think it's not that difficult to say, well, my partner's left me for somebody else, that's unreasonable behaviour. I don't think we need to go into the sexual ins and outs of that. I think it's fairly clear for everybody to see that would be irretrievable breakdown of the relationship, and I can't see that it would cause a problem. I can't see a gay couple coming and saying, well, we've got to discuss consummation in front of a court in order to get divorced. I just don't see it as a problem. I think the definition is there in irretrievable breakdown and unreasonable behaviour.
Thank
Can
you.
I ask Geoffrey John? One of the points that was made to us earlier in the week by some representatives of the churches was that procreation was one of the fundamentals of marriage in the eyes of their church. What's your view on that argument?
Well, procreation clearly isn't a sine qua non of marriage. Scripturally, it's not even the first purpose of marriage. God makes Eve for Adam because it was not good for man to be alone. And indeed, in modern marriage services, the companionship element of marriage is now put first. And of course, the church has always married couples who are beyond the age of childbearing. This point has been made again and again. So I don't really understand why people are clinging to that view. Can I say something about the previous question?
Please.
I am worried about the continuing inequality in the bill as regards civil partnership. I don't understand why civil partnership remains for gay people but not for heterosexual couples. My worry is that, well, in a sense, civil partnership may bring about the very thing which the church says it fears, which is that somehow the idea of faithfulness in monogamy will be diluted by this. Because the danger of civil partnership, if it is there alongside marriage, is that it will be seen as marriage light, as it were. Where you have a lower standard of fidelity or whatever it may be, and that seems to me to be a real danger. And I was quite surprised when Maria Miller said on Tuesday, or hinted at least, that civil partnership was continuing because the church was asking for it. I find that's quite ironic in a way, because the church will be accomplishing the very thing it says it wants to avoid, which is to undermine the call to unbreakable fidelity in marriage. I very much want to stick to that call to fidelity, and I'm worried that continuing civil partnerships only for gay people will undermine that.
So do I understand, not that you're saying that you want to see civil partnership no longer possible, but you think it should be equally possible to opposite-sex and same-sex couples?
Yes, I think civil partnership should be equally unavailable to gay and
unavailable.
Unavailable.
So you're like, okay, thank you. What would happen to people who are currently in civil partnerships?
I'm sorry?
What would you therefore do about people who are currently in civil partnerships?
I think they would have the choice of converting it to marriage, and I'm sure the overwhelming majority would want to do that. I think the second best would be to have civil partnership equal to both. What I think isn't acceptable is having it only for gay people.
Thank you.
Thank you.
David Burrows.
Yes. Can I take a view that's shared by another individual who's not speaking on behalf of the Church of England, but speaking on behalf of an individual in the Church of England like yourself,
Speak up a bit, David.
who says, it'll get louder now, who says this in submission to the committee. He's disappointed by the marriage bill. He says that adopting this bill gives us another anachronistic law in which it allows same-sex couples to marry, but the laws around the consummation and dissolution of those marriages remain strictly heterosexual. It feels to me a bit like the Deed of Union in 1536 when Welsh people were accepted as English citizens as long as they gave up their Welshness. He basically says what the Equal Marriage Bill doesn't say to LGBT people, different from what Alice Arnold said, is you are accepted as who you are. It says you are acceptable because you conform. Do you agree?
You or me?
I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. You're saying
Well,
that
I'm just simply saying what Mr. Jones says. He's basically saying that there are still inequalities that are within the bill, and that there is still a need to conform with a heteronormative ideal of marriage.
I think marriage is, whatever marriage is, will be up to the couple that are married. I'm not sure that a gay couple would be thinking, oh gosh, I've got to conform to the heterosexual ways of marriage, whatever they are, and they're different for every heterosexual couple, I assume. I don't know. I don't think most gay people I know would feel moulded by having to conform to something. I do think there is the issue with civil partnerships in that for some women, particularly I think, that marriage has a sort of patriarchal overtone that some women feel very strongly, straight and gay, that they don't like. And that could be a bit of an issue for some people, I think. I'm not sure what my conclusion is on that, but I don't think that by becoming, Claire and I would get married. That's what we do. We may not have a big celebration, but we'll certainly get a piece of paper. I don't think that makes us conform to anything other than we already are.
Okay.
It was a bit difficult to follow what the chap was saying. He sounded a bit like sort of 1960s and 70s early radical gay people who wanted to say that somehow promiscuity was inherent in being gay and perhaps one ought to conform to that. I'm extremely hostile to that view. I think that all people, the vast majority of people, need this kind of covenant framework in which to live and love someone else in order to achieve their maximum fulfillment and happiness in life. And I think it applies equally to gay people and straight people.
Just to go back, so would you say, just dealing with the concern about this anachronistic law in relation to consummation and adultery, that that still has to be dealt with, or is it fine as the bill says, or should we move to a point where we don't make a big deal of this in relation to marriage per se?
I'm not sure about the details of the law of adultery as it stands. I would like the assumption to be, for gay people and straight people, that sexual fidelity was an absolute demand of the marriage bond. And I think that should be made clear in the legislation, however it's made clear.
Thank you. Stephen Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Alice mentioned earlier she'd like to marry Claire Baldwin. You've also admitted you're not particularly religious. I just wondered what sort of wedding you'd like to have.
Well, probably just a big party. I think we this is the issue that... No, none of you are coming.
Feel free not to answer. It's nothing to do with the bill.
There was a serious question. Would you like a humanist wedding, for instance?
No, I don't think we'd... This is for people going forward who haven't done a civil partnership, then obviously they would get married. I have to say, as a couple who have done our civil partnership, which is a horrible expression, but we are civilly partnered, we actually already had a ceremony in a registry office with the registrar and witnesses, and we had a massive party. So we both feel quite sorry. We probably don't need to do all that again. And I'm not one for retaking vows. I think you make a vow for life, and we made them. So we don't need to do it again. We will get a piece of paper and then probably throw a party. Humanist, religious, none of that comes into it. For me, for people going forward, they will not have to deal with the changing over of the piece of paper and paying 20 quid or whatever it's got. They'll get the married thing straight away, and good for them. I wish we could have done.
Thank you very much. Simon Kirby.
Could I ask Mr.
Go on then.
A question. No presents either, I suppose, if you don't have a second ceremony. Reverend John said, mentioned politics of the Church on several occasions. Is the Church of England's resistance to going down this line more to do with the international dimension of trying to keep African churches in particular on board? Is that why the Church of England is in such a tangle over its attitude to homosexuality, or is it an intra-Church of England schism?
It's both. There's a significant minority within the Church which is vehemently opposed to any sort of same-sex relationship, and who fairly frequently threaten to secede in one way or another. And of course, it is the case that the majority of Anglicans, or nearly the majority, are now in Africa, many of them in Anglican churches or living under governments which are severely homophobic, I think I can use that word in that instance, and where gay people are in some danger, I think. But I fear it is the case that what the Church of England does about this subject in various departments is far too much conditioned by a wish to appease the churches in Africa.
Thank you very much. Simon Kirby.
Thank you. Reverend John, following on from that question, are you a lone voice in the wilderness or are there others clearing the way in the Church of England for same-sex marriage?
I'm certainly not a lone voice. There are lots of people who agree with me. I strongly suspect that it's now a majority of people in the church who would agree with me, and certainly a very great majority would agree that there should be some kind of recognition, a blessing ceremony or whatever, for civil partnerships. So I think we're very much moving in that direction. I think that quite a significant part, if not the majority of the church's leadership, agrees with me, but most of them feel they can't say that in public. And one of the problems, I think, that we are in the Church of England is that there is a real divergence between the teaching that is put forward publicly on these issues and what is actually said and done privately. We have a real gulf between the public morality of the church and the private morality that's used by bishops and church leaders in the study, as it were. And that is very worrying. It's one of the most corrosive things at the heart of the church at the moment that we need to address.
Desmond Swain.
Just two brief questions for the Dean. First of all, with respect to maintaining civil partnerships for same-sex couples, do you not accept that there might be a case where there would be a number of same-sex couples who would accept the orthodox teaching of their churches, as currently stated, that marriage isn't for them, and therefore they would accept that civil partnerships would be the right thing for them until the position of their orthodox churches changed? And secondly, taking you back to St. Paul, do you consider that St. Paul's teaching might have been more informed by his experience of the public sexual indulgence, both heterosexual and homosexual, associated with temple cults and prostitution, which in effect amounted to a form of idolatry, and that was that informs his epistles rather than individual relationships?
Which clause is that? Your remarks might be wanting to refer to the bill as well.
Can I take the second part first? Yes, clearly Paul does associate this with idolatry in Romans 1. So, as I mentioned, I think that Paul had in mind the prevalent forms of homosexual practice which he saw in the society around him, namely pederasty and paedophilia. It's not so clear. We don't know so much about what really went on in the temple cult, so I'm not sure about that. Can you remind me of the first part?
The other one was continuing civil partnerships for those people who would accept the church's current teaching on marriage.
I could sympathise with them, but I would disagree with their theology, because the fact is there is no theology which would justify a sexual relationship, a civil partnership that was sexually active, which wasn't based on the kind of marriage covenant theology which undergirds marriage. So there isn't really a difference theologically. Provided the covenant is absolutely faithful and based on monogamous promises, then I would say it's de facto a marriage anyway. So there isn't really a theological difference that they ought to be taking a stand on. What I think is going to happen, however, politically, is that the church will, first of all, bless civil partnerships and will ultimately then bless marriages. But in doing it that way, it will be completely incoherent theologically. But that doesn't really stop it.
And that certainly wouldn't be a first for the Church of England. Given what you say about, in your view, the majority of ordinary members of the Church of England being sympathetic, and many senior clergymen and parish priests, and given the experience of what happened when divorcees were remarried for the first time,
yes.
You say you wouldn't want the church to be forced to do anything, but what about a permissive regime within the Church of England that allowed individual parishes that wanted to?
I think that would be marvellous, and it would be more genuinely Anglican, frankly. And I hope that is where we end up. I think but at the moment, of course, there is a complete block on any progress whatsoever, and that's what's so inequitable about the present situation. It was slightly annoying on Tuesday listening to the exchange with the Bishop of Norwich, because everyone in a rather jocular way was talking about the wonderful breadth and comprehensiveness of the Church of England. Actually, on this subject, it's not at all broad or at all comprehensive. It is extremely exclusive. And I think we'd be in a much more genuinely Anglican and Christian position if people were allowed to follow their conscience on this.
Although, to be fair to the Bishop of Norwich, he made quite clear he didn't agree with the Church's official position on civil partnerships.
Yes, although I'm not sure what he was saying, because, of course, the Church of England is still saying that civil partnerships ought to be non-sexual, and that's still demanded of the clergy if they're in civil partnerships.
Can I just ask a sort of broader question? I mean, we've heard from a lot of religious representatives in the course of these two sessions. What strikes me as a member of the Church of England and someone who would like to be married is these different religious representatives seem to me to believe completely different things, but they all call themselves Christians. I mean, there seem to be those who, for dogmatic reasons or reasons of adherence to literal readings of Scripture, could never countenance a change. And then there seem to be others, you, the Quakers, the liberal Jews, even the Bishop of Norwich, who were edging towards a different place. How are these positions ever going to be reconciled?
I'm not God. I don't know. I'm afraid religion is vociferous by nature, and I don't know how they will be reconciled, although I think on this subject they will be reconciled by people seeing that love works in exactly the same way between two people of the same sex as between different sexes. I think it's seeing it that will convert people in the end.
Thank you very much. Tim Lawton.
Can I have two questions for the Dean? Carrying on from your wish to have perhaps a pick and mix situation in the Church of England, I think logically that's absolutely right. Who would determine, though, as to whether a parish could have a vicar who would conduct same-sex services? At the moment we have this rather dodgy arrangement whereby certain dioceses are reserved for very conservative bishops, including my own, which has broken down in one or two cases. But would it be up to the PCC? Would it be up to the bishop? Would it be up to where those appointments are in the hands of the local squire, as was indeed my father's parish when he was a practising vicar? Who would actually determine it?
Well, I think the natural solution would be the one that, in fact, obtains now with respect to remarrying people who've been divorced. And that is up to the parish priest in consultation with the bishop and with the consent of the PCC. And I think it would probably work in exactly the same way perfectly well.
And if there was a discrepancy between the bishop and the PCC, they get the veto, do they?
I don't think that ultimately the bishop can overrule the parish priest in terms of marrying divorcees. I'm not absolutely certain about that. I think that a parish priest does have an absolute right ultimately.
Can the bishop not remove his licence?
I don't think so, not for remarrying divorcees, but I'm on slightly shaky ground.
Okay, my second point, before I get cut off again, I'll just leave it at that, was you made the point about registrars earlier, a completely different issue, and you said, and I entirely agree with you, that we should be able to make individual arrangements for registrars and not to single them out. Now, of course, that can't happen, and in law it's been challenged in the European Court. So do you think that to achieve that we need to change the Equality Act of 2010, which I think we should? Do you think that would strengthen this bill if we were to do that and you would support that and campaign for it?
I'm not sure. I think what I would like to see would be more common sense applied on the ground in individual cases, and I suspect it is probably in most cases where people have that kind of conscientious objection. I'm sure there are far more registrars.
But it's not backed up in law, as we've now found out.
No, it's not backed up in law.
So would you like to see it backed up in law?
I think it would be a good thing to do, provided it didn't then trespass too much on other rights.
Okay, thank you.
I'm sure that would be a balance.
David Burrows.
In terms of the formal position of the Church of England, which we heard on Tuesday, in the light of that, do you think that the current provisions within the bill in relation to the quadruple lock, do those properly give sufficient, do they sufficiently reflect the fact that the Church's position presently obviously is that it is not in favour of same-sex marriage? And do you think that the bill, in terms of the locks, is sufficient and adequate?
Yes, and as was clear on Tuesday, so did the official organs of the church. So yes, clearly, they're sufficient.
In terms of you said the majority of the Church of England are with you in your view. Do you have any evidence for that?
No, not apart from such statistical surveys as have been taken. And I did a quick review of them yesterday. Some of them are a bit ambiguous, I have to say. But on the whole, I think there's evidence of a very clear movement towards the direction of acceptance. As I say, I think the majority of the church, now a clear majority, would be in favour of some sort of blessing or dedication service which would accept civil partnerships as a way of affirming gay relationships. Whether a clear majority is yet in favour of same-sex marriage, I'm not sure.
And just in terms of if the church was to accommodate your view in relation to same-sex marriage, would that then mean that the actual church service and the vows that are given would have to change?
I imagine they would have to change to some extent, but I wouldn't expect them to be essentially different.
And would that reflect on a change of the meaning and purpose of marriage?
In my view, no.
Okay, thank you. Last two questions are from Simon Kirby and then Stephen Dowdy has the final question. Simon.
Thank you, Mr. Streeter. This is a question to Alice. You and Claire are two very high-profile people. Apart from marriage bringing two of you joy, what message would it send to perhaps younger people?
Well, that's why I'm here, really, I think, to talk about that. I think people live in a world where, and we think, we don't know very many homophobic people, and you may think that Claire and I go swan through life without any homophobia. I would encourage any of you to search our names on Twitter on a Saturday night and have a look at what you see there. It's filthy. It's really filthy and incredibly hurtful. I don't let Claire see it most of the time, but it's really out there. So you can live your life as a gay person, surrounding yourself, working for institutions that have equality, and feel quite happy about it until you see that and you realise how vicious it is out there. And I think any legislation that brings us true equality will affect the generation below us. It's not going to help us. There are still those homophobic people out there. I hope it will help the people in 20, 30 years' time who will see that we are truly equal and some of that homophobia might disappear. That's my plea.
Thank you. Stephen Dowdy, final question.
Thank you, Mr. Streeter. I couldn't agree with you more, Alice. And I said quite clearly in my, I'm a practicing Christian, but I don't believe my faith has a monopoly on marriage. And one of the crucial things I think we're missing, we've got into a lot of the debates around the impact on churches and religious organisations. Of course, one of the crucial aspects of this bill is the opening up of civil marriage to same-sex couples. And I just wondered, as a non-religious person, reflecting on what you've heard of the debate, what do you feel when you see this going on? Do you think that bit is actually being lost? Well,
I do. I mean, everything seems to centre around religious objection. 2/3 of people don't get married in a church. 2/3 of people don't get married in a church. But yet all the debate seems to centre around religious objection, and loads of us don't have a religion. It's not important to us. What's important to us is the law. And it should be separate, I believe, from religion. And of course people who want to get married in a church or have their civil partnerships blessed, or that's their choice, but the law of this country has to be equal for everybody. People make a choice about whether to be religious or not. They don't make a choice about whether to be gay. And I think there's been far too much weight put on the religious argument, actually. I think we should get back to what an ordinary person feels.
Would the Dean like a final comment?
Well, I'm sympathetic to that view, but of course, at the same time, I'm biased, and I think that the religious arguments have to be dealt with. But
I know they have to be dealt with. I just think they're kind of all that's
But I'm really sorry. I'd like to apologise on behalf of making it so difficult.
All right, well, thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed to both of our witnesses this afternoon. You've been absolutely very helpful and very informative. We're very grateful to you. Thank you indeed for coming. We wish you well. And we have our final set of witnesses who are going to come forward. Aren't they? Kate is looking at me. Well, thank you for being with us this afternoon, and could you kindly introduce yourselves for the record, and then we'll get straight down to questions. Mr. O'Neill. Mr. Jones, indeed.
I'm Mark Jones. I'm a solicitor in private practice,
Thank you.
specialising in employment and discrimination law.
Thank you.
I'm Brendan O'Neill. I'm a journalist and editor.
Thank you. First question, Kate Green.
Can you tell me what you think would be the disadvantages of allowing same-sex couples to marry?
Well, I act for a number of individuals. Obviously, as a solicitor in private practice, I get calls all the time and emails from people who are concerned about their workplace situation. And I also have a particular reputation that means I get a lot of people who find there's religious conscience issues within the workplace who approach me. So putting myself to one side and speaking on their behalf, the sorts of problems we come across are workplace conversations. For example, where somebody has asked their view. What do you think about marriage? What's your definition of marriage? How do you feel about same-sex marriage? They give their honest view, whether it's informed by religious belief or not, that perhaps they say, I believe that marriage is the union of one man to one woman for life, exclusion of all others. The other person says, I have a different view, and perhaps they actually take offence at that. And they can say, I feel that you are a bigot because of your view.
So is that a reason not to let people marry, though? I mean, I accept that there may be argument and dissent, but is that a reason for preventing same-sex marriage?
So you asked me what problems could arise?
Yes, I'm now asking a follow-up.
Okay, shall I not answer that?
Well, answer the first question first, and then we'll see how we go.
I'm grateful, thank you. So the concern is that being described as being a bigot, homophobic, a discriminator, is then obviously an extremely uncomfortable experience for that individual. It creates a workplace conflict and often is resolved by the person resigning. So then your follow-up question, does it create does allowing same-sex marriage create a problem for an individual? It could do for an individual whose work situation, for example, a registrar, I suppose, a registrar whose personal conscience is that they are unable to form a same-sex union because they believe that it's contrary to their conscience. So for them, yes, I could see that it's a problem.
Sorry, Mr. O'Neill, would you like to?
For me, the problem with same-sex marriage is that it intensifies state intervention into private life and into the area of love and commitment. And I recognise, of course, that the state has always brokered marriage and has always overseen it and has administrated it in recent times. But what this bill does is it gives the state greater leeway to define the meaning of marriage, the moral meaning of it, which is something that the state has not previously done. The meaning of marriage has always been decided by communities over great numbers of centuries. And now you have the situation where marriage is being thrown open to redefinition by the state, not simply brokering by the state. And I think that's a step too far for libertarians such as me.
Thank you. David Burrows.
Beyond the marriage ceremony, where do you see that there could be problems arising as a result of this bill in terms of applications of the public sector equality duty and other issues like that?
Okay. So moving a slightly impact upon registrars, for example, so to other workplace situations. I suppose the teachers is the one that is most concerning, partly because it's, I suppose, the most close to home. I'm married to a teacher myself. So within the public sector, I don't know whether the individuals here have had the opportunity to see the opinion of John Bowers QC. I have had the opportunity to read it, and he expresses some concern about the impact of the Public Sector Equality Duty upon people within the teaching profession. I think there are two aspects. There is, firstly, the element of whether somebody needs to present a positive image of same-sex marriage that they might feel personally uncomfortable with, answering questions from pupils and perhaps giving a caveat of their own opinion, which of course may lay them open for a sense of taunting from individuals being accused of being a bigot or whatever, and those staff room discussions where there's an exchange of view. So, but in terms of a positive duty, the public sector equality duty does introduce that positive obligation to present marriage in a particular way. I don't have an issue with marriage being presented positively, but for those for whom they draw a distinction between same-sex marriage and heterosexual marriage, yes, I can see great difficulties.
Mr. Burrows?
Yes, beyond the schools, can you see it impacting there in the further way? We've had these with the Adrian Smith case and things like that that have been presented. Can you see it impacting in those ways?
Well, I can see it anywhere where there's a conversation. For example, in the Adrian Smith case, where the gentleman made the Facebook comments, and I mean the observation there of the judge, that those were not inappropriate comments made on Facebook, but they were viewed inappropriately and acted upon. There was another case with that gentleman, Mr. Chondle versus Liverpool City Council. Mr. Chondle was an individual who said to the person they were providing a service to, "Do you believe in God or go to church?" And he was disciplined for that being gross misconduct. Now, the employment judge in that case said, that expression, that view, that's not unreasonable, but because the employer had taken the view that it was an unreasonable view, and they would have taken that view whether or not it was informed by a Christian belief or any other belief, that difference in opinion, they were justified. There was no discrimination element. So anywhere where where there's a workplace where there will be discussion, there's going to be conflict of opinion, that people struggle to resolve that conflict because of their own personal views on it, I can see difficulties, that people will be criticised for having expressed perfectly reasonable, temperate views.
So what would you recommend for the bill to deal with those issues?
I think what needs to be given is some assurance to people that these are conversations they don't need to be afraid about having. The vast majority of people are perfectly able to have these sorts of reasonable discussions.
In terms of legislation, is there anything that needs to be put in the bill in relation to the Equality Act or anything like that?
Yes, well, I would want to see provision for reasonable accommodation as a principle, that there is the ability for these views to be reconciled, that it's not that whether or not somebody takes offence, it's still a question of whether or not it's been reasonably expressed, whether that view can be accommodated. And secondly, I think provision for freedom of conscience, so that conscience can be accepted in the workplace, and a positive message is sent to people that you don't need to be ashamed about your views. They are, whilst we may disagree with them, that nobody is going to penalise you for holding them.
Thank you. Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Shooter, and thank you, gentlemen, for coming along as well. I'm very keen to the last on Tuesday we had a presentation here by Lord Panic and Lady Kennedy. And they gave a very clear legal opinion which stated that they felt that the quadruple lock was sufficient to protect religious opinion. What you have indicated to the previous questioner was that you feel that maybe that protection isn't in place the way that it should be for those with personal conscience. I'm keen to get your thoughts upon perhaps how or can legislation be put in place that will give protection to those with individual conscience, first of all. And you've also talked about the timetable of the bill. Do you feel that there's enough time for this bill to be fully considered in the timescale that we're looking at?
I don't feel really able to give a personal opinion on that, but what I think one thing needs clarification. The quadruple lock is obviously about the church's position, not the position of individual employees in the workplace.
Mr. O'Neill, do you have a comment on the quadruple lock?
I think it's a little bit of a red herring, if I may say so, because I think the authoritarianism that Mark is talking about reflects the authoritarianism that exists in the bill itself. I think they are intertwined. So the fact that it might be possible for people to be reprimanded for criticising gay marriage, I think is a reflection of the fact that the gay marriage campaign has in essence been an authoritarian one. And right from the beginning, the ability of people to say, I think same-sex marriage is ridiculous, has been quite restricted. It's been restricted. You are referred to as a bigot, you're referred to as hateful, you're referred to as homophobic, simply for opposing a government proposal to institute a new form of marriage. So I think the potential authoritarian consequences that we are talking about reflect the fact that to overhaul marriage in this unilateral way is in itself an authoritarian step.
The issue of Lillian Liddell is one that many of us are some concern over. That's a lady who had a contract with a council, which was different from the civil partnership, and suddenly found that she had her contract changed in the middle of that there, and then a court case was taken to which overruled and disadvantaged her in a great way. With that happening in someone who had employment before with a different contract, Can you understand the concerns that those with Christian beliefs and religious convictions have in relation to this legislative change? And how do you see that working for Christians? How can we assure Christians of the right legal way to ensure that their protection is there for them?
I can see the concerns Christians have. I'm personally not a Christian myself. I'm an atheist, but I can see the concerns they have. What I'm worried about is that in focusing on Christian concerns, we're overlooking the more subtle attack that is being launched, in my view, by this bill, which is on the millions of people who are already married, who entered into marriage for very specific reasons, and who one day in the near future will wake up in a different institution than the one they entered into. They will wake up in one that is about companionship rather than about generational renewal and something more social. So I'm worried about the consequences of overhauling an institution for the people who are already members of it.
My apologies.
Sorry. As actually asked the lawyer for Miss Liddell, I might be able to add an additional impact talk to that. It does greatly concern me. I mean, I have to declare the interest that I am Miss Liddell's lawyer, and so I cannot claim complete partiality, impartiality in that area. But I think her case is one that is extremely concerning, and because she was an individual who, as you say, her job changed, and there was no idea that it was going to change in that way. She made her employer aware before they decided to designate her a civil partner of the effect it would have, and they decided to make her a civil partner without any consultation with her at all. And there was it was accepted that there would be no impact upon the service delivery, so there was no reason beyond an ideological one, because of the Dignity for All policy, to make her a civil partnership registrar or required to do the services. And she was, despite being designated, so then she could do it, she was still allowed initially a dispensation, so she didn't have to. And when she explained her religious beliefs in a letter that was described by the Employment Appeal Tribunal as being temperate and reasonable, that was described as being gross misconduct by her employer, and not just an ordinary employee. This was the Assistant Director of Law within the council. Now, it may be that somebody like that some of the eminent QCs who have spoken here would say, well, this is nonsense. This is like somebody complaining about the snow being cleared from outside the front of their path. But as an individual employee without pro bono access to the leading QCs who can argue their corner and establish it, to be told by an assistant director of law that your expression of your temperate view is gross misconduct is terrifying. And what do we tell an individual in the workplace in that situation to do? The majority of them simply resign quietly.
Thank you very much. Kwasi Kwarteng.
Thank you very much. I think we've gone on at some length about matters of individual conscience. And I'm particularly interested in what you have to say, Mr. O'Neill, with regard to where you think this campaign for gay marriage was coming from. Because the notes that we've seen say that you think that the campaign was rootless, and you think it says more about the political class than about any need for the ground up for this sort of legislation. I just thought, in the very brief time that we have, that you might want to talk more about that.
No, I think same-sex marriage is an entirely invented, purely symbolic issue, and it doesn't have any roots in social activism. There have been no public protests for gay marriage. And it doesn't have its roots in old-style gay rights activism either, because if you go back to original gay rights activism, that was more concerned with criticising the institution of marriage than it was with joining it. So it's a very new campaign, it's very rootless, it's very unhistorical, and I think it's driven more by the needs of the political class today for an issue around which they can define their morality, around which they can say, we're good, we're liberal, we're the new Rosa Parks, we're the new Martin Luther Kings, look what we're doing. And that's why I think it only animates people within the political and media classes. If you talk to ordinary people, they are so completely unmoved by this issue. Now, I know there are lots of opinion polls which show that small majorities think it's a good idea, 55%, 50%, and so on. But if you look at those opinion polls in detail, you'll notice that larger majorities think it's not an important issue. 78% think it's not an important issue. Only 7% say it's an issue that will determine how they vote in the next election. So yes, people are tolerant of homosexuals, which is a wonderful, great thing, but they are confused by the priority that is given to this issue. And I don't think that's surprising, because this issue came out of thin air, and it's largely being pursued for the benefits of individual politicians and campaigners, rather than for the benefits of society. And I think the political class has lost sight of the benefits of marriage for society in its rush to advertise that it is modern and new and liberal.
Thank you very much. Stephen Doherty.
But by that logic, Mr O'Neill, Parliament wouldn't spend half the time discussing half the issues it does, because a lot of the public wouldn't consider, 90% of the time wouldn't consider a lot of things we discuss in here important. We still need to make laws on them. We still need to discuss them. And it's a completely fallacious argument. And I really do have to take issue with the point you make about the grassroots nature of the campaign and where it came from. So I've certainly had people on the door raise it with me, gay and lesbian people who want to get married. I had it during my by-election in November. And they were like, why is this currently not allowed? And it might have been a different sort of campaign than traditional ones in the past with people doing that. But I mean, surely when you've heard the evidence from some of the groups that have been in here who have indeed been campaigning around the issue, surely doesn't that contradict what you're saying?
Those are not what I would describe as grassroots campaigners. They are sharp-suited lobbyists. They are small groups of people they are small, and there's plenty of room for those people in the world, but they are not grassroots campaigners by any stretch of the imagination. And I'm not just saying that gay rights campaigning has changed in the way it's carried out. I'm saying that this represents a complete break with what gay rights activists called for in the past. Mm-hmm. If you look at the first gay pride parade in 1972, they described marriage as a prison for women, children and homosexuals, and they said this prison needs to be abolished. So there has been a dramatic shift in what gay people are demanding. The Stonewall rioters of 1969 said that all social institutions, including marriage, needed to be abolished. Now you have representatives of something called Stonewall coming in here and saying, oh, we really want to get married. So we can at least talk about there being a severe break with the gay liberation politics of the past and what this campaign represents. I think it's an elitist campaign which doesn't have any traction with the public.
Thank you very much. Desmond Swain.
Elderly couple in a same-sex relationship came to see me recently, and they'd been in civil partnership since that institution became available, although their relationship was much older. They had kept their relationship secret throughout their professional lives because it was unlawful. They were serving in the Royal Navy. They're very grateful for the changes that had been made and for civil partnerships, but they wanted to get married. They complained that they could go to Spain and get married. Why could they not get married in the country which they had served throughout their professional lives? Do you not accept that it's a reasonable thing, however bourgeois it might be, of them to desire that, and a reasonable thing for me as a legislator to seek to accommodate? And how will, by my accommodating them, will that change in any way the marriage that I have?
Mr O'Neill.
Well, if you read the government's consultation paper on same-sex marriage, it does not mention family or children or community except when it twice talks about the transgender community. It doesn't mention the fundamental things that marriage was originally bound up with, which was about managing and organising the renewal of generations and interaction between generations. So I think you're right to say that you are elevating a bourgeois view of marriage, which is marriage as companionship, which is marriage as Cameron's government describes it, between two people. But for a great number of people out there, beyond your old couple, there are millions of people for whom marriage is about more than two people. It's about family, it's about children, it's about a community. It's about binding yourself together, not just to an individual, but to society itself. So I think it is perfectly reasonable for you to pay attention to the old couple who came to see you. I think it's unreasonable for politicians to redefine marriage as it's understood by millions of people for the benefit of themselves and for the benefit of small groups of other people out there.
Thank you. Mr Jones, did you have a view on Mr Swain's point?
Yes, well, I suppose what I can pass on is what I was told this morning by a former registrar who decided that she needed to leave the service when she felt compromised, that she was in touch with her former colleagues. And there's a dozen or so within this particular service. And with regard to all of them, including some who hold a religious belief and some of no religious belief, she was explaining, look, at the beginning of the service, we explain what marriage is, that it is that it's one man, one woman, voluntarily entered into for life with exclusion of all others. And there's a notice to that effect in every registry office in England and Wales. And the explanation I was given was that there is extreme confusion and actually distress for every single individual within that organisation about the definition. It's what they have based their understanding on. They've gone into the job. That's the explanation they give at every marriage that sets out, presumably it's consistent with their belief, not a conflict of conscience. And now they're going to have to be saying something different. Now, so it comes down to, I suppose the starting point is it appropriate to redefine? What's the impact of that definition? I suppose the impact is upon those who attach a value to the original definition. And what value do we attach to the value they attach to that?
Thank you very much. Ben Bradshaw, followed by Stephen Williams.
Sorry, forgive me, Mr. Jones, if I've misunderstood you, but you seem to be saying from your advocation of a freedom of conscience clause and the referral you made to the lady you've been representing, that you would advocate people being allowed to disobey the law, in effect, if it conflicted with their religious...
Well, a freedom of conscience would mean it's consistent with the law. So if there isn't a provision, then yes, you'd be requiring them to act in conflict with the law.
But you would like, in effect, for registrars not to have to perform same-sex marriages. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm not coming from a person... So, for example, you've got ability for people who have conscientious objection to abortion.
Look, can you answer my question?
Be accommodated. So,
can you answer my specific question?
So for the registrars in that situation, would I like those registrars to have to choose between their job and their conscience? No, I would like their conscience to be accommodated.
So you'd
in the
like
workplace.
them to be able to disobey the law. And what about the provision of goods and services? Would you like to extend it to the provision of goods and services law?
Would you like to give me a scenario?
Well,
so bed and breakfast, for example, sort of situation.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not an employment context, so I have to say that I've not been approached by anybody in that situation who's been conflicted.
So where would you draw the line in terms of allowing people to ignore the law because of their religious feelings, beliefs?
Well, it's not, it's not, if you make provision for conscientious objection, it's not ignoring the law, you are still within the law. If you don't make that provision, then you're asking the person to either step outside of the law or take themselves out of the situation where they're in conflict with their conscience. In the bed and breakfast situation, I suppose you're saying, well, if you cannot reconcile that with your conscience, then you stop running a bed and breakfast. Should that person have the ability to turn somebody away because of their sexuality or because of any other reason? Personally, I feel, I do have some discomfort about that, but I've not been presented with a situation, so no individual has approached me who I can report to the committee and say, look, this is what I would need in order to be accommodated in that situation.
Thank you. And we've got a number of colleagues who still indicated we've only got 10 minutes left, so Stephen Williams.
This is for Mr. O'Neill. I always raise my eyebrows and smile inwardly when a journalist or columnist refers to ordinary people and implies that politicians are out of touch. And we call ordinary people constituents, and that's the advantage of being a constituency MP, particularly if, like me, I've lived in my seat all my adult life. I only open my front door, and I'm confronted with people's opinions every single day that I'm at home. So we do have a reasonable sort of political compass as to what people are thinking. But I was wondering what your evidence was, not just your opinion, but what your evidence was for saying there was no demand at all from gay, lesbian or bisexual people for equal marriage.
Well, if you look at the way in which this is compared to the civil rights movement in America in the 1950s and 60s, for example, the differences are astounding. In America in the 1950s and 60s, there were mass protests, there were year-long boycotts, there was fighting, there were water cannons, people were arrested, put in jail. It went on, it was violent, it lasted for years. I'm explaining to you what I think is there's been no real demand for it. Here, on this issue, there has been no campaigning like that whatsoever. You just had a few campaigners say, we would like to get married. You had some national treasures like Elton John agreeing with them, and all of a sudden it is the main political and moral issue of our time. The ease with which it became the key issue of our time is the most striking thing, which I think speaks to the way in which it plays a useful role for politicians more than it does any palpable thirst on the ground for marriage to be redefined in order to allow homosexuals to get married. So there has been no visible, obvious street fighting or protesting or marches or long fights for this right to get married. It came out of nowhere, which is why I think ordinary people or constituents or the public or whatever we want to call them are quite perplexed by this issue, which is reflected in opinion polls which show that very small numbers of people think it's a political priority, which suggests to me that they are confused as to why it's been prioritised in the way that it has.
I've got 3 questioners left and about 7 minutes, so please brief questions and answers. Stephen Doughty.
To be honest, Chair, I'm so bemused by the comments
Okay.
I've heard. Please carry on.
David Burrows.
Do you say as a redefinition of marriage, how would you say that? Many say that this may well undermine marriage. Is that an undermining in law or in culture? How do you see that playing out?
I think there has been a collapse of what marriage represents in culture, in society. Fewer people are getting married than ever before. There are lots of divorces and so on and so forth. And it's worth having a debate about that, I think. But that needs to be kept separate from this campaign, which I think is redefining marriage. It's redefining marriage away from its role as a communal thing, through which people brought up the next generation, through which they tied themselves and their children into their community. It's redefining it away from that towards two people. If you look at the government's consultation on this prior to the bill being published, it says two people, two people, two people. It alienates marriage and turns it into a very individualised, bourgeois institution of companionship, rather than what it was and what it is for millions of people, which is a social tool for bringing up the next generation.
Thank you. Simon Kirby.
Yeah, on that very point, if marriage is only about generational renewal, what do we say to couples who are too old to have children, or choose not to have children, or sadly aren't able to have children? And indeed, what do we make of the special provision in the 1949 Act that provides for deathbed marriages? Surely none of those are about generational renewal, but are marriages nonetheless.
I'm not saying it's only about generational renewal. I'm saying that's a key, important aspect of it for many people. Now, you can all roll your eyes and mock as much as you want, but no, some people over here are. But what I'm saying is that for great numbers of people out there, marriage is not just about two people. It is about generational renewal. Even when people get married and they don't have children, or people get married later in life, it's measured against the ideal of marriage, which even for all the trials and tribulations it's gone through over the past 50 or 100 years, the ideal of marriage is still as a social mechanism for coming together in order to raise children, in order to raise the next generation. And I think politicians are creating a real rod for their backs if they undermine that institution without thinking about it very carefully first.
Thank you very much. Mr. Jones, did you want to comment at all on that exchange?
Yes, I'll just make one point. I mean, I'm married. My wife and I, we can't have children. Does that devalue our marriage? No. I'm looked occasionally at pityingly by some people who wish we could have children. I'm looked occasionally enviously by some people who do have children. But when my wife and I, when we, apologies to my wife, she watches this, but when we come together, there is a union. There is that, we're doing the same thing that other people do, whose bodies have the ability to pass on their genetic material and create new life. It's that union of a man and a woman, and that is something special about marriage. And like I said, it's the wording that's used within the civil marriage service. Now, of course, there are arguments for changing that. Society changes, perhaps you ought to reflect it. My concern is one that, I mean, if I'm somebody who is saying, you know what, I'm coming as a homosexual person, I would like my views to be adopted, I would like that to be considered, that's perfectly fine. But I would be absolutely appalled if I felt in order to accommodate me, you were compelling somebody to act against their religious conscience. I would not want that done in my name.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, colleagues, our time has gone, and thank you to our last two witnesses for your expert and helpful evidence. Much appreciated. Now, colleagues, I've got some things I've got to say to you. The committee will sit again for line-by-line consideration of the bill at 8:55 a.m. on Tuesday, the 26th of February, in Committee Room 9. And I remind members that the deadline for tabling amendments to be considered on that date is 4:30 p.m. on Thursday, the 21st of February. Order, order. Good night.